What is up, awesome peeps? Brent McCluskey here with Electrified Reviews, and today we are going over the Addmotor Hithot H1 electric mountain bike. This thing has front and rear suspension. It has a huge 48 volt, 10.4 amp hour battery. It has pedal assist, it has a throttle, and it has a really nice expansive control center right up here on the handlebars. This thing is built for taking on the trails, and we are going to dive into this bike right now. Okay, how sweet was that intro, right? Okay, we are going to talk about the specs of this bike, the pros and the cons, and some things I'd like to see done differently. But to start, we're going to talk about the power. The Hithot H1 comes with a Bafang 500 watt hub motor. So this thing is positioned in the back of the bike, 500 watts of nominal power, but it can boost or have a peak wattage of up to 750 watts, which is actually pretty powerful. If you think about it, an average Olympic athlete has about 250 watts of power output. So this thing is kind of like having two Olympic athletes helping you while you're riding. This particular motor is also very quiet, and it's pretty efficient at 500 watts, which means you'll probably get a pretty good range out of this bike. Now, along with power comes speed, so let's talk about the speed. The top speed of the Hithot H1 is about 20 miles per hour. Now you can use the throttle to hit that speed, or you can use the pedal assist. Now the pedal assist here is a cadence sensing pedal assist, so it measures the rotation of the cranks as opposed to a torque sensing pedal assist, which measures the actual torque or the pressure that you are putting on the cranks themselves. Generally, cadence sensors aren't going to be as accurate or sensitive as a torque sensor, but this one gets the job done. Now, what's cool about the throttle is you can use this thing independently of the pedals. So you can just treat this as a moped or a scooter, and you don't have to pedal at all. Use the throttle to get where you're going, and with the 500 watt motor, I was able to get this thing up to the top speed of 20 miles per hour, which is a pretty good feat considering that I weigh 200 pounds. Moving right along, let's talk about specs. This bike is about 73.5 inches in length by 25 inches in width, with a standover height of 29.5 inches and a reach of 23.5 inches. In total, this thing weighs about 53 pounds, which is not that heavy considering it has full suspension. In the front, we have Suntour XCT suspension with about 100 millimeters of travel. These are spring suspension with preload adjuster and a lockout. And in the back, we've got a coil suspension, which is about 22 millimeters of travel. Now, the only downside of having the coil suspension here in the back along with the hub motor is that we have what's called unsuspended weight. So basically what that means is because of the location of the hub motor here in the back, this rear suspension is going to have to work a little bit harder as opposed to if the motor was located in the middle like a mid-drive motor. This bike also has mechanical disc brakes in the front and the rear with 180 millimeter rotors in the front and 160 millimeter rotors in the rear. The tires themselves are 27.5 by 2.3 inches, pretty standard tires, no puncture protection, so if you live in an area with a bunch of thorns or if you experience flats really frequently, you might want to consider throwing some goo in there or slapping on some puncture-proof tires. Up on the handlebars, we have the Shimano SIS index trigger shifter, which leads down to the Shimano tourney derailleur here on the bottom. This is a 7-speed derailleur. It's a pretty entry-level one from Shimano, but in my experience, it gets the job done. Up here on the front of the bike, we also have motor inhibitors attached to the brake levers. So whenever you depress the brake levers, it shuts off the motor automatically, which is great for safety because if you are in an emergency situation, you forget to let off the throttle while you're stopping, the motor will still shut off, and it just basically ensures you have the shortest possible stopping distance. The Hithot H1 also has a 48 volt, 10.4 amp hour removable battery, which is great because that means you can charge this thing while it's on the bike or while it's off. It also means you can store the battery in a cool location that's dry. It just kind of helps improve the overall longevity of the battery. This bike also has a couple of different accent options. So the main color is going to be black, but you also have the option of going with blue, yellow, green, or orange for the accents. All right, awesome peeps, we've talked about the specs, we've talked about the speed, we've talked about the motor. Now it's time to list off some of the pros and some of the cons. Pro number one is going to be the fact that this thing is full suspension. Now, even though this suspension setup is not top of the line, it still gets the job done. And even for me, a 200-pound rider, I found that it was actually pretty good. Now remember, if you do want to stiffen or make the suspension more spongy, you can adjust the preload adjuster on the front suspension, and you can also adjust the preload on the rear suspension as well. Pro number two is going to be the throttle. For me, I always love it when bikes have throttles because it just expands the overall uses that this thing can fill. You can treat it as a traditional bike, you can shut off the motor completely, you can use pedal assist, or you can forget pedaling altogether and use a throttle and it becomes more like a moped or a scooter. And for the third pro, I'm going with the control center. This thing has a pretty fair amount of information on it. You've got top speed, average speed, max speed, odometer, tripometer, the time, the temperature out, what level of pedal assist you're on. It has your battery level on there. And it's also a backlit display, which is nice because that means you can see it in low light or even in no light situations. For the next pro, I'm going with the motor. I personally really like Bafang motors. I've tested quite a few of them. They always run really well. I've never had any issues with them, and 500 watts of power is not that bad. It's enough to get you up a pretty steep amount of hills, and while you might have to pedal a little bit, it's definitely better than no motor at all. And for the last pro, I'm going with the weight. At 53 pounds, this bike is a lot lighter than some of the other electric bikes that I've tested that don't have any suspension at all. So given the fact this thing has front suspension and rear suspension, an integrated light, a pretty large battery of about 10.4 amp hours, 53 pounds is not that heavy. All right, peeps, we've talked about the pros, but like any product, there are going to be some cons, so let's talk about the cons. Now for the first con, I'm going with Cadence Sensor. Now, while it's not necessarily a con in and of itself, I personally prefer torque sensors, but of course, this is a affordable electric bike and Addmotor had to save some money somewhere, so it makes sense that they would go with a cadence sensor as opposed to a torque sensor. Con number two is going to be the front headlamp. Now, I love that this thing does have a headlamp included in the base model of this bike, but you really can't use it to illuminate your path. Really, this front headlamp is meant for letting people see you better at night, for just increasing overall visibility, but for actually seeing where you're going during night rides, it doesn't really help out that much. For the next con, I am going with the tires. Again, not really a con, but the fact that they don't have any sort of puncture protection in them, especially for a off-road bike that's really meant for mountain bike riding, that could pose some issues depending on where you live. Not a huge deal, but definitely something I wanted to throw up there in the cons column. And for the last con, I am going with the lack of color options for this thing. Now, I do like that there are a couple of different color accents that you can choose from, but really the only main color you have is black. And if you want, like, let's say a more visible bike that you could see better in the nighttime, like a white color would be better, maybe even a gray or something a little bit reflective like a brushed aluminum. But really, again, all you have here is black with different color accents. All right, peeps, we've talked about the pros, we've talked about the cons, we pretty much covered this bike as a basic overview. Now I want to talk about who is this bike really for. So the Addmotor Hithot H1 runs for $16.99, which in my opinion is a pretty affordable price for what you're getting with this bike. So because these aren't the highest level of shocks in the front or shocks in the rear, this really isn't like a super intense downhill racing mountain bike, but you can still hit some jumps with this thing. You can still go on and off of curbs. You can tackle some pretty difficult terrain with this, and it still does a really good job. So I think this bike is really meant for people who are looking to get into the electric bike arena, but maybe don't have thousands and thousands of dollars to spend, but they still want a bike that's going to be able to get them through the city and also through some decent trails if they choose to go there. So again, affordable bike, lots of cool upgraded features that come stock on this thing. Overall, I had a lot of fun testing this thing. And for anybody else who has this bike, I'd love to hear your feedback on it, your thoughts, and to see what your experience has been with this bike as well. That is it, guys, for the Addmotor Hithot H1 review. I hope you guys dug this review. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and drop them in the comment section down below. If there's any other electric bikes, electric scooters, electric skateboards, or anything else you want to see reviewed, leave that in the comments as well, and I will try to get back to you guys as quickly as possible. So thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great day, and peace.